So I'm excited to share with you about how to have productive and compassionate conversations about abortion. And I'm curious, by a show of hands, how many of you have ever had a conversation with somebody that you knew supported abortion and tried to convince them to become pro-life? How did it go? Thumbs up, or kind of thumbs in the middle, or kind of thumbs down? That is the experience that most people have, myself included, especially when I first got involved. I still remember the first time I had a conversation with somebody about the issue of abortion. It was in my grade 10 math class. And growing up in British Columbia, the teachers in British Columbia love going on strike, especially in the public school. And so going to a private Catholic school, we didn't go on strike. And so we were 2 weeks ahead of the public schools. And so we weren't quite as efficient. We didn't need to be quite as efficient in our studies. And so at the beginning of a math class, my math teacher proposed this question. Unfortunately, sometimes teachers at Catholic schools are not pro-life. And he proposed a scenario that he read in a book called Freakonomics. Is anyone familiar with the book Freakonomics? It's a fascinating book. I don't think it needs to go to the top of your reading list, but it's a neat book. And what the argument was that in the country of Romania, when abortion was made legal, what they found was that approximately 16 years after abortion was made legal, the crime rate began to decrease. And so my teacher proposed this and said, wouldn't abortion be an appropriate solution to decreasing the crime rate? And as a pro-lifer, I put up my hand and I said, but sir, it's a baby. And he looked at me and he said, Cam, I know it's a baby, but what about the victims of crime? Don't their lives have value? But sir, it's a baby. I had no idea how to navigate that conversation. Thankfully, one of my classmates was a little bit more wise when it comes to how to communicate the pro-life position. And instead of stating a conclusion, she asked a question. She said, sir, could we agree that we don't want repeat offenders in our society? And he looked at her and he said, yeah, we don't want people committing multiple crimes. And she asked, would it be an appropriate solution to decreasing the repeat offender rate if we just killed everybody after their first crime? Then we wouldn't have to worry about anybody committing multiple crimes. At that point, my teacher found it convenient to dive back into math. Didn't really want to answer that question, and that's where we are today. And so that's what I want to talk about tonight, or this morning, sorry. I usually give my presentations in the evening. That's what I want to talk about tonight. We all want to get here. We want to talk to people, and we want them to accept the pro-life position, right? That's what we want, correct? Boom. How do we do that? How do we do that? That's what today is all about. And we're actually going to have an opportunity today to get some experience doing that. During the youth outreach time in the afternoon, we have an opportunity to implement some of the skills that I'm going to talk about into actually changing minds, and by the grace of God, saving lives. That is our goal. That is our hope. And we have seen these apologetic skills used time and time again to achieve just that. And so how are we going to get there? I'm going to walk through a bit of a system, I suppose. Every conversation about abortion is different. And that's because everybody in Canada has different reasons for holding the position that they hold. They may hold the position because they themselves have had a personal experience with abortion. They may hold the position of ignorance or apathy because they're unaware of the situation in Canada. They don't know that abortion is legal until birth in Canada. They don't know that abortion is happening nearly 300 times every single day. Or they may hold the pro-life position because they were simply raised in a Christian home or they never knew otherwise. And so we want people to end with this. But the system that I want to share with you is that instead of simply, like I started with when I was in high school, shouting out a conclusion, we want to navigate the conversation, first of all, by meeting people where they are at, by bridging the gap between where we are and where they are, so that they know that they're heard, so that they know that they're understood, so that they know that we are connecting with them. After that, we're going to go one of two directions. Often, We want to go to the core question in this issue, and I think that's incredibly important. And what is the core question when it comes to whether or not abortion is a human right or a human rights violation? That core question is the humanity of the preborn. Because if the preborn are not human, then no justification for abortion is necessary. And yet if the preborn are human, then no justification of abortion is adequate. And so that is the route that we want to go whenever we have the opportunity to. Meeting them where they're at, and then introducing the truth that we need to answer this question: when does human life begin? And should all members of the human species get human rights? And yet, as I mentioned, there are so many people in Canada who have been personally impacted by abortion. Blaise shared last night during his Euthanasia Apologetics the importance of heart apologetics. How to meet people where they're at and help them navigate their own personal experiences. Because when we understand that every year 100,000 preborn children are directly and intentionally killed by abortion, that means likely 100,000 mothers and fathers and cousins and siblings and grandparents and neighbors impacted by abortion. And so we need to realize that this issue hits to the heart for so many people, and we need to engage them where they're at. We need to talk with them, and we need to minister to their heart, helping them find hope and healing, while also walking them towards that acceptance of the pro-life position. And so sometimes we go in between those two middle area conversation elements. Sometimes we'll go back and forth between talking about the humanity of the preborn and talking about the situations in which people were placed in, why they may have chosen abortion. It is absolutely essential that we do this. And through these conversations, we are able to walk people towards becoming fully pro-life. And so that's the goal today. And my goal is to walk through how we do that. I am still hoping that Justina will be able to join us towards the end of the presentation and kind of crescendo through to the end. But I want to start by talking about wisdom. Wisdom, as I mentioned before, is essential when trying to change minds and save lives on the abortion issue. We have to know more than facts. We have to know more than information, because we have to be able to navigate the intricacies that are the human mind and the human heart. And there's 3 tools that I think are incredibly important when it comes to being wise and prudent pro-life ambassadors. And they are common ground, analogies, and questions. And you might wonder, why do we want to start conversations this way? And I'll throw that to you. Why would you think that common ground is important when we're having conversations with people about abortion? To establish a trusting relationship, exactly. Because I like to ask this question: how many of you like losing at anything? I'm incredibly competitive. I play a lot of sports, I play a lot of board games, I get in a lot of arguments. I don't like losing. And what do we do when we're afraid of losing? We often shut down. We either avoid the situation, or we put up this massive defense around us so that nobody could ever penetrate close enough to defeat us, because we hate losing so much. And so by building a trusting relationship with somebody, by showing that this isn't a me versus you confrontation, but rather a we together conversation, then we're able to make incredible steps towards bringing people to the pro-life position. Why do we think it's important to incorporate analogies into the pro-life conversations that we're having? I'm all about back and forth audience engagement. Boom. I think that's a great answer. That obviously the abortion issue is very emotionally charged for many people. And so by making an analogy, we may be able to help them understand a principle without that emotional baggage that may come with the abortion issue. There's another reason why I think it's important to make analogies. How many of you have ever met a human fetus or a human embryo? Not very many of us, right? We might have a picture, an ultrasound picture on our fridge from our own child or from a loved one's child. We have never met these humans, and so we may find it difficult to relate to these humans. That's why for so many of the campaigns that seek to bring about foreign aid and many other important ministries, we need to visualize the people that we are serving. By making an analogy, by introducing an infant or trotting out a toddler, we are able to bring the conversation around a human being that we understand without a doubt as being a human being, that we understand without a doubt as deserving human rights. And so by talking about that analogy, by trotting out that toddler, we are able to show and illustrate a principle and then apply it to what may be a more foreign concept. And finally, I'll do it with a question. Why are questions important? It gets you thinking. Exactly. Who do we trust the most? Generally speaking, who do we trust the most? Many of us here may honestly or want to be honest about saying we trust God the most. And I think that's wonderful when we do trust in God, because God knows so much more than we could ever possibly know. That could be a whole other talk unto itself. That could be a whole other conference unto itself. I think that by and large, not only the people in this room, but also the people outside of this room, we trust ourselves. And why do we trust ourselves? We trust ourselves because we can see how we come to particular conclusions. Right? And so by asking questions, we can draw people towards a particular conclusion and actually have them accept it, because they are answering the question in their own mind. They are the ones providing the conclusions to the questions, and so they can trace their progress towards that conclusion. If I were to simply share a conclusion with them, then they might be reluctant to accept that because they don't know how I came to that conclusion. I'll make an analogy about making questions, because why not? Let's get some practice on it. If you and I were doing a math equation and we got different answers, what would be the most productive way of finding which answer is actually correct? Should we shout our conclusions back and forth? I got 3, you got 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4? Or would it make more sense to demonstrate your evidence and ask them, okay, so when you did this, how did you get that conclusion? Okay, so when you made this step, how did that draw towards this number? Asking questions and trying to inspect their work in a charitable way will actually draw them towards, okay, well, I see where I went wrong. I see that I thought that this could equal that, but it doesn't actually. By asking questions, we are able to draw out of people the conclusions that we may already have in our mind. And so those 3 tools are going to be essential for when we're having conversations about abortion. Because what we find when we ask people how they feel about abortion or what they think about abortion, oftentimes they will respond by saying they support abortion because of a particular hard circumstance. Maybe they'll say, well, I support abortion when a mother is living in poverty and she can't support the children that she may have born already, let alone this new addition to her family. Maybe they'll say, I support abortion when a mother is faced with a decision between a child and her career or her education. Maybe the age of the mother, maybe she's simply not mature enough. So many other reasons that we have for why abortion should be an appropriate solution to whatever challenges we're faced with. And it is not to our advantage to try to answer and solve poverty, because we haven't solved poverty yet, and yet we don't kill born people living in poverty, right? And when we do, we try to stop that. And so we don't want to spend our entire conversation talking about the circumstances, but rather demonstrating, meeting them where they're at, and then demonstrating how the principle of when human life begins and whether all humans should get human rights is what we really need to be talking about. And so I want to practice that right now, actually. I want to dive in to an example. If I was asked to respond to somebody who said, I think abortion is appropriate when a mother is living in poverty, when she does not have the financial resources to support that growing child, what do I say? How do I apply those 3 strategies? First of all, I'm going to find common ground. I'm going to say to them, you know what? I agree with you that raising a child while living in poverty would be incredibly difficult. We can all agree on that, right? Raising a child in poverty is not ideal. And like Blaise said last night, we don't want that to happen per se. I agree with you that that is a difficult situation. Step 2, common ground we've done. Next to the analogy, I would say, imagine that a mother has 2 born children, and now she is faced with poverty, whether it's because her partner has left her, whether it's because of other financial crisis. Imagine that a mother with born children were living in a similar circumstance. Would we be willing to kill a born child, a toddler, to solve that hard scenario? Thankfully, the vast majority of people that you'll talk to will say no. No, that's not appropriate. If they say that is appropriate, you might need to make a phone call to your local police detachment or have a much deeper conversation about the dignity of human life. So that is your common ground, your analogy. The last step, if it is not appropriate to kill a born child to cope with the hard situation of poverty, then why a preborn child? What is the difference? You see what I did there? We're no longer talking about poverty and whether or not poverty is hard and whether or not poverty is a reality in Canada. We're not talking about that anymore. We've met them where they're at, we've empathized with them, and now we're walking towards that core question of when does human life begin? And so that is the same process that we can do for each of these scenarios. There's 2 more that I want to focus on before I move on to the next step of the conversation process that I want to propose. And these are the 2 often most common and often most difficult situations that we can encounter. The first that I'll say is the situation of sexual assault. I'm sure that the people that we've talked to, I'm sure that the people that you've seen posting online will very frequently introduce the horrendous situation of sexual assault. How do we respond? Do we need to throw up our hands and say, oh, well, okay, maybe in that scenario? No. Not even then. We're going to follow the exact same route that we're talking about before. We need to invest even more energy in finding that common ground. Not that we want to deal with any of these circumstances flippantly, but we want to respond and really confirm with the person that they know where we're at. And so I might say something to the effect of, you and I can agree that sexual assault is one of the most heinous crimes in our world. And that we need to do more, not only to prevent sexual assault from happening, but also to punish those who do commit the horrendous act of sexual assault and to support those who have been victimized. We need to do more. Can we agree on that? I need a verbal confirmation. We are on the same page. You know how seriously I am taking that scenario. And so I'm going to invest a little bit more time in that common ground, and then the rest of the process is somewhat similar. We may need to dive into hard apologetics, which I'll talk about towards the end, and yet the analogy, you might find it a little bit tricky. How do I come up with an analogy about rape? That sounds like a terrible, terrible thing. Like, how could you even do that? We may be tempted to oversimplify it and say, oh, well, what if a mother gets raped and she decides that she doesn't want to kill the child until after they're born? Some people might blow that off as that's not a reality. And so I try to bring it a little bit more closer to reality. That we have all heard terrible stories of people living in violent and abusive relationships, right? We read about them in the paper, we hear about them on the news, and tragically there are mothers in our world with born children living in abusive relationships, either because they have convinced themselves that they are somehow guilty themselves, or because it's not all that bad. What do we do in these scenarios? We get those mothers into safe houses. We get them out of those abusive relationships. That needs to be our highest priority. And yet after that, once they come to realize, you know what, this was a terrible, terrible situation. The blinds, the curtains have been lifted, and I realized just how wrong this relationship was. And now when I look at my 2-year-old and my 3-year-old, I'm no longer convincing myself that the father of that child is a wonderful man, or at least a just man. If that mother now looks at her born child and is reminded of a violent abuser, would we ever suggest that she should be allowed to kill that born child? No. And if not a born child, why a preborn child? Okay? Make sense? If you have questions, shoot them into Alex. With that then, the last one that I'll say before I move on is the situation of health of the mother. And this one comes up frequently, and there's an extra step that I feel is important when talking about the health of the mother. And that is the definition of abortion. We want to find common ground just like we always do. I could not even imagine how difficult it would be for a mother to be forced to make a decision between her own life and the life of her child. And yet before we go into our analogy, it is so important that we define our terms. How many of us here would define abortion as anything that kills a preborn human? Many of us. And yet I want to add to that definition. I want to add by saying abortion, in my mind, and I would love to have a conversation about this, abortion ought to be defined as the direct and intentional killing of a preborn child. Why do I make that distinction? Because there are medical procedures that do not intend and do not act directly on preborn children that may bring about their tragic, though not unjust, death. And I'll give you a concrete example of that. Several years ago, there was a mother living in the Dominican Republic. And she was a young mother, and she was diagnosed with very late-term cancer. And yet the doctors thought that if they gave this young woman cancer treatment, that they might be able to save her. And yet this woman had an extra complication in the eyes of the world, that she was also pregnant. And the doctors told her that if she were to choose chemotherapy and radiation, it would save her life, but it would tragically bring about the death of her child. When abortion advocates worldwide heard this story, they thought, finally, we have a case. We can break the pro-life position. And yet, the deeper understanding, chemotherapy and radiation is not intending to kill a preborn child. It is a tragic effect of that. And yet we are neither intending nor directly acting upon that preborn child. And that's why I would consider that not an abortion. That is a tragedy, but not an injustice. I can fall out of my boat and drown. And if Alex is in the boat with me and he cannot save me, then that's a tragedy. And yet if Alex pushes me out of the boat and holds my head underwater, I have drowned in both situations. And yet in one, there is intent and there is injustice. And in the other, there is tragedy. And that's a distinction that we need to make when we're talking about abortion. Does that make sense? Excellent, thank you. Moving on then, what's the next natural question that we're going to ask? We're talking about the humanity of the preborn now. And this is where the conversation goes. But they are not human. They are a clump of cells, they're a blob of tissue, they are something different than you and I. And you might feel like you are ill-equipped to answer that question. You might feel like, you know what, I wasn't very strong in biology in high school, let alone in university. You don't need to have a doctorate degree in biology to know when human life begins. You don't need to have a doctorate degree in biology to be able to convince somebody else as to when human life begins. I want to propose 4 questions that I have used on countless occasions that have literally brought people from a complete support of abortion to a complete rejection of abortion in less than 5 minutes. And you may not believe that, and if you don't believe that, then sign up for door knocking today. And you will see that happen before your eyes by the grace of God. So the first question that we want to ask people when we're talking about the humanity of the preborn is, do you believe all humans should get human rights? We want to use the language of human rights because that's what's going to resonate with people in a secular culture. Instead of talking about human dignity initially, we want to talk about human rights because that's language that can be received by anybody, regardless of their faith background or absence of faith background. We all agree that we need to go deeper, that only talking about abortion is not sufficient for Christians. We need to go deeper than talking about human rights. We need to ask, where do human rights come from? And yet the vast majority of people, this will resonate with them. And so this is the first question we want to ask time and time again. The second question is, if something's growing, isn't it alive? Is there anything that's growing that isn't alive? I love getting creative answers on that. I've heard lots of different things. I've heard icicles. I've heard stalagmites. I've heard lots of different examples of things that appear to be growing but aren't really growing. My favorite one is flames in a fire. The warmer it gets, the bigger the flames get, they're growing and they are not alive. And while some people might debate whether or not fire is alive, somebody like me who loves sitting out at a campfire all night long and there's life in there for me, I know there isn't biological life and that there's a difference between construction and development. There's a difference between tacking more stuff on the outside of an icicle or a stalagmite and providing the resources of life to a living entity and having an internal force direct the growth and development of that entity. My favorite one, though, is when people say, well, grass is alive, and you cut your lawn, don't you? Thank you. That is exactly the route that I want to go. Because the next question that I want to ask is, if two humans reproduce, what will their offspring be? Are we ever worried when we find out that our sister or our wife or our daughter is pregnant? Are we ever worried that, oh no, maybe they'll be the one who delivers a cat or a dog, and we'll be the shame of the neighborhood, and we'll have to move and change our names and all that kind of stuff because we don't want to be on the record as being those humans that gave birth to something that wasn't human? No, we never worry about that. We know that humans reproduce to have more humans. And so if we know that there is life from the very moment of fertilization, from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells, that growth indicating life, and that living organism has human parents, that living organism must be a living member of the human species. And if they're a living member of the human species, wouldn't that mean that abortion, which kills a living member of the human species, wouldn't that make abortion a human rights violation? So many people in today's society are aware of the importance of defending the human rights of the weak and vulnerable. I think that we've made incredible steps in many areas of society, defending the weak and vulnerable. And yet, when we understand this, when we understand that preborn children are living members of the human species from the very moment of fertilization, can we not agree that abortion must then be a human rights violation? And yet, you might have people that try to challenge a couple of these points. We know that questions 2 and 3 are focused on biology. And maybe people will say, oh, well, you're just exploiting a loophole. Just a common sense kind of loophole. This isn't actually a living member of the species. What do I suggest then? Do you then say, you know what? Oh no, I'm not a doctor in biology. I thought that was going to work and it didn't work. What do I do now? What should you do now? Pull out your phone. How many of you have internet on your phone? Most of you. How many of you have ever Googled, when does human life begin? Guess what? You don't get some statement from the Pope. You get a whole lot of statements from very credible, very secular biologists acknowledging that human life begins at fertilization. This is not a Christian point. This is not something that you read in some obscure chapter of the Bible. This is something that literally every credible biologist will acknowledge. Okay? And so you don't need to carry this textbook in your back pocket because you probably have your phone in the back pocket. And whether you're like me and you don't really like having a smartphone and you kind of wish that you had a job that you didn't need a phone at all, or whether you love your phone, you can whip out your phone and say, hey, let's Google it together. What do you say to that? We can do it on Google if you want. I don't work for Google. I'm not trying to pump them. If you're a Bing person or if you're a Yahoo kind of person, do whatever your favorite search engine is. You will find time and again that unless you are reading literally from the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada website, you will read that human life begins at fertilization. All right? And yes? Yeah. We see in the news all the time how corrupt some of these major entities are and how, like Christian ads and whatever else are getting knocked down by Google or Facebook or these other entities. And that's a whole nother conversation. And yet, even Google can't deny human life begins at fertilization. They don't have enough results to even pull one page because all of the results that they're pulling are coming from either the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada or a credible biological source. And so we go back here and we say, okay, well, we've dealt with the humanity of the preborn. What about the other end? These aren't biological questions per se. Questions about human rights, that isn't defined in any biology textbook per se. And so these are more philosophical questions. And do you need to have a doctorate in philosophy to answer these? I don't think so. I don't, and I feel like I can answer them. And so unless I'm some kind of unicorn, I genuinely believe that every single person here can follow this up. Because often we'll get that response after that of, oh, I'm not ready to abandon my support of abortion. I'm not ready to abandon that. Okay, fine, they're human. I will concede that they are human, but they don't get human rights. But they're not persons, but they're not valuable. Where do we go from there? It can be incredibly frustrating. And yet when we look at ourselves as adults, everyone in this room knows that this is a living member of the human species and that they should get human rights. And everyone in this room knows that embryos and fetuses are living members of the human species. And so how do we connect this for people? We connect it by introducing the infant again. We go back to that analogy model and demonstrate that the differences that exist between born human beings and preborn human beings, generally speaking, can fit into one of four categories. First, our size. Second, our level of development. Third, our environment. And fourth, our degree of dependency. These come up in conversation. Oh, well, they don't have a rational mind. Oh, well, they're so small, they're smaller than a dot on a page. Well, they can't survive on their own, or they're inside of their mother's body. Should we be debating as to whether or not these differences exist? No. Please do not debate whether or not these differences exist. Please do not try to debate whether or not a one-cell human zygote has a rational mind. Please do not debate whether or not a 8-week embryo is fully developed. Please don't try to debate whether or not a child that's living inside of their mother's womb is actually living outside of their mother's womb. We don't need to be afraid of the fact that these differences exist because we know that these differences are irrelevant when it comes to whether or not a human should get human rights. Because each of these differences also exist for born humans. Because we're not born at full size. My wife is due to give birth to our first daughter on Tuesday. And she's very thankful that we are not born. Thank you. We're super excited. So I keep an eye on the door in case I get a phone call saying that, that the baby's on the way and I'm going to have to pull somebody else up here to do this presentation. She's very thankful that human babies aren't born at full size because there aren't very many people who'd have more than one, let alone the one. We also know that newborn children are not fully developed. We know that based on their sensory organs. We also know that based on their reproductive organs. Human beings are not fully developed when they're first born. And yet we don't kill them after they're born, right? And so if level of development doesn't matter after you're born, then why before you're born? We can trace each of these towards a conclusion that we've seen time and time again throughout history. And that is that when people discriminate human rights when people say that you have to be human plus X, they are never doing that because they want to give more human rights out. They're doing that because they find it advantageous or convenient to deny human rights. And we have seen that, like I said, throughout history. We have said in the past that you had to be human plus Caucasian to get human rights. We have said that you have to be human plus male to get human rights. And we have said that you have to be human plus able-bodied to get human rights. Right now, we are saying that you have to be human plus a particular age to get human rights. Abortion is age-based discrimination. Every justification that we have for why we can kill a preborn child but not a born child is directly tied to the age of that human. Abortion is age-based discrimination. And so, with that then, I think that it is absolutely essential that we, as pro-lifers, come to know the reality of what abortion does to a preborn child. At CCBR, we are convinced that it is essential for committed, confident, and competent pro-life action to be acquainted with the victims of who it is that we are defending. People ask me every day why I go out day after day to have conversations with people about abortion. For the last 7 years, I've been having about 1,000 conversations a year with completely random strangers who will say all sorts of different things. And sometimes, I gotta be honest with you, there are days when I don't want to go out and talk to people. There are days when I don't want to be active in the pro-life movement. What inspires me to be active? Certainly the testimonies egg me on. I have that desire for that wonderful God-given gift of seeing somebody change their mind. But also I'm reminded of the 300 preborn children who are killed by abortion. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show a video that shows the reality of what abortion does to a preborn child. There's music in the background, and so if you choose to look away or step out of the room, you will know when the video is over. And so if that's your decision, I completely respect that. And yet with that, I will start this video, and we will see the victims that we need to defend from abortion.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That all men are
Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. We have an opportunity to do that, and it requires courage. It requires grace, and it requires prayer. Because I've seen this video hundreds of times, and yet it hits me to the core every time I see it. And I'm sure many of you have the same response. Because those children are not simply statistics. Those children are not numbers. Those children are not principles. Those children are God's children. And those children are our children. And we have an opportunity to act courageously to defend those children. Through our daily lives, through the people that we come in contact with, our children, our neighbors, our friends, whomever it may be, we have an opportunity to make justice a reality for all of God's children. What I think it would be appropriate to do now is actually to end a little bit early. And I know that many of you have texted in questions. What I think it would be appropriate to do would be to spend some time coping with that reality, understanding the magnitude of the issue that we're dealing with, but also understanding the opportunity that we have to respond to it. I will be at the CCBR table, and I will have several other volunteers there as well, and I would love to talk with you and have conversations about how to have productive conversations about how you can get involved and how you can end the killing of preborn children. We are doing this day after day in cities and towns across Canada, and we want you to be a part of that reality. We want you to join us, because every day that our volunteer and intern teams go out, we see minds changed. And when minds change, behavior changes. And when behavior changes, children are born who may otherwise have been aborted. And so if you want to help CCBR to grow, to get more and more young people, our internships every year have dozens of young people from across Canada, many of them, many alumni here with us this weekend. If you want to help CCBR grow and transform our culture, I want to invite you to consider filling out the donation form in your package. I want you to consider how you can become financial investors in CCBR's strategy to end the killing. Thank you very much.